Chapter 1291. The car stopped outside of the hotel. After that, Nolan and Maisie got to the restaurant. The fact that there was no one in the restaurant other than the waiters meant that someone had booked the entire restaurant. The waiters stood uniformly in one line and greeted, "Welcome." Maisie walked to a white table, prepared with a large bouquet of black roses on it. She couldn't help herself and chuckled. After that, he turned around to look at Nolan. "This is the surprise you prepared for me?" Nolan pulled the chair for her. When she sat down, he leaned closer and said, "It's to celebrate that your dream has finally come true, Z." He walked away and sat opposite Maisie. He told the waiter to get them a bottle of red wine. Resting her chin on her palm, Maisie looked at him and smiled. "It's to catch up to you. But I still have a long way to go." He took over the red wine and poured it into the decanter. "You can consider yourself very good if you can get into the top 10. Maisie lifted her eyebrows. "No. I can't bring disgrace to you. I must get into the top 3. Nolan grabbed the foot of the wine glass and swirled it gently. He lifted his eyelids to look at her and chuckled. "You have a great ambition, Z. Because I want to stand with you." Maisie picked up her glass of wine and looked at him through the glass. "I don't just want to be your wife. I want to be someone who can stand with you on equal ground." Nolan chuckled deeply and touched his glass with hers. "Then I'll be looking forward to the day you chase up to me, Z." Maisie and Nolan left the restaurant after finishing their meal. When they came out of the hotel, the woman who walked past Maisie made her stop in her tracks. She turned her head around and looked. Hugging her, Nolan asked, "What's wrong?" Maisie looked at the familiar figure and frowned. She did not know why, but the woman gave her a bad vibe. However, she shouldn't be someone she knew. She shook her head and said, "Let's go watch a movie." "Didn't Helios direct a movie?" "It's his first movie that he directed, and I heard it's pretty good." "Let's go support him." "Anything you say." "After all, you're in charge today." Both of them went back into the car, and the moment the car was driven away, the woman emerged from the stairs. She watched as the car slowly disappeared from her vision. She looked at her flawlessly crafted artificial face through the glass as a grim smile flashed across her eyes. "Maisie, Nolan, I'm back." The next day, at a coffee shop. "Hey, I heard that you and your husband went to support Helios movie?" Barbara asked as she sipped on the coffee. Her daughter, Beatrice, was sitting next to her. She was 2 years old this year, and she was eating a cake. There were bits of cake around her mouth, and she talked to her mother in a baby voice, "Mommy, help me wipe my mouth." Barbara helplessly pulled out a tissue and wiped her mouth. "Am I your maid or your mother?" Beatrice hummed and continued to munch on her cake. Maisie couldn't help herself and laughed. Bea is just like Daisy when she was a kid. Both of them are foodies. Daisy, Colton, and Waylon were 13 years old this year. They had already grown up, and she missed the way they looked when they were little kids. They looked just like angels. She could only stare at other people's kids now. She reached out to Beatrice and said, "Bea, can I have some too?" Beatrice hesitated for a while before scooping up a piece with a spoon and handing it to her. Maisie's heart melted, and she pinched her cheek. "You're so adorable. How about coming home with me? I'm sure Daisy, Colton, and Waylon will be very happy when they see you." Barbara smacked her hand away and said, "Leave my daughter alone. If you want a kid, then go have one yourself. Judging from Mr. Goldman's wealth, I'm sure it isn't a problem at all for him to raise 6 or 7 kids." Maisie chuckled. "What am I? A sow? I don't want to have a baby anymore. 3 are more than enough." But if the little one was still here. Chapter 1292. "Huh?" Barbara looked at Maisie. Maisie smiled and shook her head. "Nothing. If she had not had a miscarriage that year, she would have 4 kids by now. Maybe this was her fate. Until now, she did not intend to have a 4th kid. In the meantime, in the interview room of the Black Gold Group, the female interviewee accurately analyzed the industry data of the Black Gold Group, and her confidence made the three interviewers nod with satisfaction. They flipped across her profile. Cecil Wolfsbane, 29 years old, graduated from a prestigious university in Staslo with a master's degree in architecture. Her academic background was perfect. An interviewer rose to his feet and said, "That's all for today, Ms. Wolfsbane. We'll be in touch with you if you're shortlisted." Cecil smiled and stood up. She nodded and said, "Thank you." After that, she took her purse and left the interview room without turning her head back. At that moment, Quincy came over. He subconsciously took a glance at her, and she nodded at him with a smile while walking away. He was stunned for a moment and turned his head around to look at the woman. She indeed was very pretty, but he did not know why, but he sensed a strange and eerie vibe from her. When the three interviewers came out of the interview room, they saw Quincy and greeted him. "Mr. Lawson." Quincy looked at them and asked, "Was she here for an interview?" "Yeah. She wants to join our planning department. By the way, this is her resume," an interviewer said as he handed the resume to Quincy. Quincy took over and flipped through it while immersed in his thoughts. He arrived at the administrative department and knocked on the door. He then approached the desk and said, "Mr. Goldman, this is the resume for the interviewee." Nolan closed the document in his hand and took over the resume. Quincy pressed his lips thin and said, "The woman who came for an interview today has a beautiful academic background. She studied architecture and graduated from a renowned university overseas. The interviewer said she knew our company very well, so I guess she must have done some research on us." "But..." Nolan narrowed his eyes. "But what?" Quincy scratched his head. "I don't know why, but this woman is exuding a strange vibe. The way she looked at me gave me the impression that she knew me." Nolan did not say anything in return and looked at the resume. The woman in the photo had a perfect face. She looked so perfect that she seemed like a fake person. However, no matter how beautiful she was still not as beautiful as Maisie. He put the resume down and lifted his head to look at him. "Why? You like her?" Quincy was stumped. He hastily shook his hand. Nope. Absolutely not." Leaning against the back of the chair, Nolan tapped the desk with his finger in a rhythmic tempo and said, "You aren't young anymore. It's almost time for you to form a family. Please, not you too, Mr. Goldman. I'm going to jump off a building if you guys don't stop urging me to find a wife," Quincy said. "I didn't complain about anything when you left the company in my hands to enjoy your life with your wife back then, and now you want me to get a wife? I think should just kill myself instead." Nolan squinted. "What's wrong? Did you wake up on the wrong side of the bed this morning?" Quincy lowered his head and kept silent. "Can't I even rant a little bit?" Nolan pushed the document on the desk back to him and ordered, "Inform the Human Resource Department. I'll let them be in charge of the new recruitment." "Okay," Quincy replied. He had just complained about his boss, so he dared not to stay here anymore. He took the document and left immediately. At night, a group of men was beating a woman in an alley. The woman huddled on the ground with her head in her hands, and the air was filled with her intermittent cries. A middle-aged man wearing a golden ring was sitting in the car. He took a drag from his cigarette before ordering his men to stop. He emerged from the car, approached the woman, flicked the ashes on her, and said, "Linda, we've signed an agreement. If you pull out right now, you'll need to pay me $150,000. Chapter 1293. Linda trembled and lifted her head. She hugged his leg and pleaded, "Mr. Donovan, I didn't want to run. It's just that person is too scary. I don't want to serve him. He'll kill me." Mr. Donovan grabbed her hair and said, "This is the path you've chosen, and now you're telling me that you don't want to serve him?" He gave her a slap, causing her face to swell up. Mr. Donovan then spat on the ground and continued, You have two choices now. Either you give me $150,000, or you go back and apologize to the customer. If not, I'll kill you. Right here, right now. Linda scrambled up from the ground and got on her knees. I'll pay you. I'll pay you. She did not want to go back to face that mad customer anymore. She would die. 3 days. Mr. Donovan grabbed her hair and forced her to look him in the eyes. If I don't receive money from you in 3 days, I'll shred you to pieces and throw you into the river to feed the fish. After that, he left with his men, leaving the battered Linda behind. Linda sat paralyzed on the ground. She did not care about the pain all over her body anymore, and she let out a sigh of relief. At the very least, she did not have to return to the madman anymore. $150,000 if she wanted to get $150,000, there was only one person who could help her. The next day, at Seoul. While Maisie was reading through a document in her office, someone knocked on her door. She lifted her head and said, "Come in." Sae-dai came in and said, "Miss, the receptionist said someone is looking for you." She said she's Linda. Maisie narrowed her eyes. Maisie had heard that Yorick had taken Linda back to their hometown 3 years ago after she came out of jail. She had been rather quiet and had not caused any trouble in the past 3 years, and Maisie reckoned that she must have something to ask from her. Otherwise, she wouldn't have come here. Maisie put the document down and exited her office with Sae-dai. Linda was sitting on the bench in the lobby of the first floor. The bruises on her face were visible, and she seemed rather disorientated. What a rare guest. Linda rose to her feet and looked at her when she heard Maisie's voice. She was jealous of her and hated her. After all, she had everything she needed. She was popular and rich. Not only that, but she also had a husband who loved her deeply. Both of them were Vanderbilt descendants, but they had very different lives. Linda bit her lips and said in a low voice, "Maisie, you've got to save me." When Maisie saw the bruises on her face, she frowned slightly. "Save you?" Linda went forward and grabbed her hand. "Yes, I don't have other people to turn to anymore. You're the only one who can save me right now. If not, I'll be dead." After she finished speaking, she fell to the floor and got on her knees. Everyone who passed by turned their heads and looked at them. Maisie told Sae-dai to pick her up and turned around. "Let's go to my office. Then, we'll talk." Soon, they returned to Maisie's office, and Linda sat on the couch. Her hands were trembling when she was holding the cup. Maisie sat with her legs crossed in front of her. As she sipped on her tea, she said, "Fire it away." Linda looked at her and asked, Can you lend me $150,000? Maisie was stunned for a moment. She lifted her eyes calmly and said, "When you say save your life, you mean to borrow money?" Seeing Linda had averted her gaze, Maisie put her cup down and continued. $150,000 is a big amount. Although I can lend you the money, you need to tell me everything honestly and what you're going to do with the money. I'm going to use it to pay for the breach of a contract, Linda replied. I found a job and signed the agreement, but my company wanted me to serve a customer. That customer nearly killed me, so I don't want to work there anymore. Maisie's face sank. When you signed the contract, were you aware of the nature of the work? Chapter 1294. Maisie, do you think I'm lying to you? I'm not lying, Linda said flusteredly. It went without saying that she couldn't tell Maisie that she knew about it. She was worried Maisie wouldn't lend her the money if she told her. Linda, you should be well aware that I don't like it when other people lie to me. People who have lied once will need even more lies to cover up their previous lies. If you knew the nature of the work when you signed the contract, then you deserve what happened to you today. If you were cheated, I will help you lawfully pay the compensation, Maisie said calmly. Linda was devastated when she heard what Maisie said. Maisie, are you really not going to lend me $150,000? I'm your cousin. What do you care about $150,000 with your current status? $150,000 is money too. Maisie's face turned stern. Money doesn't grow on trees. You indeed are my cousin, but I don't have an obligation to help you. You should be grateful that I'm willing to lend the money to you, and you should never talk to me in that manner. Linda sat frozen stiff on the couch. She broke down and cried, I have only 3 days. Maisie, you aren't me. You can't understand what kind of life I'm living. Even if I go through the legal channels, they will get back at me, and I have no right to fight against them. All I can do is wait for death. Linda, Maisie said as she glanced at her deeply. Who do you think is to blame for your current situation? I have given you a lot of chances. Starting from the moment you chose to make one mistake after another, you should have known what would happen to you today. If a person refuses to change, then they can't change anything. Maisie rose to her feet and walked to the side. You could have found a peaceful job and started over like Hector did, but you didn't want to. If you trample on your dignity and don't respect yourself, no one will respect you. You come to look for my help, but you refuse to tell me the whole truth. How am I supposed to believe that you'll really turn a new leaf? How can I know that you'll find a job to pay me back the money after I've lent it to you? Biting her lips, Linda rose to her feet and said, Maisie, I was wrong about you. Now that you're rich and powerful, you look down on your poor relatives. I really shouldn't have come to you. After that, she stormed out of the office. Maisie did not stop her from leaving. When Linda came out of soul and rage, she turned around to look at the building and shouted angrily, Who do you think you are, Maisie? Do you think you're so noble? You have everything you have today, because of Mr. Goldman. Without him, you're nothing. She was not Hector, and she would never lower her head before Maisie to beg her. Just when she was about to leave, a white Land Rover stopped in front of her. The person inside rolled the window down, and when Linda saw the woman in the driving seat, she was stunned. She had never seen a woman as pretty as her. She looked just like a demoness who would lure one into the abyss. The woman smiled at her and asked, Do you need my help? Linda was stunned. She looked at her hesitantly and asked warily, Help what? Do you know me? You're Linda Vanderbilt, Maisie Vanderbilt's cousin. You were married once, but you are divorced. Most importantly, you have a grudge against Maisie. When Linda heard that the woman knew her name and the fact that she had married before, she frowned. Who are you? You don't need to know who I am. You just need to know I can help you. Cecile handed a name card to her. I know what you're working on right now and what is troubling you. When you've made up your mind, just give me a call. I'll be waiting for you. Chapter 1295. Cecile rolled the window up and drove away, leaving Linda standing frozen stiff on the spot. She looked at the name card in her hand and pressed her lips thin. In the evening, at the Blue Bay Villa. After Maisie finished her bath, she wrapped herself and her wet hair with a towel. She stood in front of her dressing table and pulled out her face cream. When Nolan came into the room, he threw the jacket on his arm to the bed and hugged her from the back. He leaned closer and whispered into her ear, What a surprise. The first thing I see after I come back is such a beautiful scene. She looked at him back through the mirror and asked, Sometimes I really wonder what's in your head. He chuckled deeply. What's in my head? It's all about you, Z. She was applying cream on her face right now. She turned her head around, and just when she attempted to wipe the remaining cream on her hand to his face, he avoided her and grabbed her wrist. He giggled and said, You're so naughty, Z. When her attempt failed, she pouted and withdrew her hand. You're so cunning. Nolan hugged her and buried his face into her neck. He grazed her skin with his lips and asked, Who is the cunning one, huh? She felt ticklish and tried to run away. Stop it, Nolan. If you don't stop it now, I'll. He looked at her with puppy eyes. Maisie pounced on him, threw him on the bed, and tickled him, but it was ineffective against Nolan. He reached out for the back of her head and planted a kiss on her lips. At that moment, her phone rang. Maisie wanted to push Nolan away, but Nolan grabbed her arms and turned around to be on top of her. He pried her teeth open and deepened his kiss. His breath was heavy and thick, just like a poison that would reap her of her consciousness. As if she was addicted to it, she was falling deeper and deeper into it. In the meantime, the one calling Maisie was none other than Linda, who had gotten Maisie's phone number from elsewhere. When she failed to get through to Maisie, she hung up the call, in rage. "Maisie, this is what you made me do. Don't blame me." He pulled out the name card and called the phone number on it. Soon, the woman answered the call. The next day, at Seoul, Maisie and Sae-dai walked into the lobby, and the staff in the lobby greeted her. "Ms. Vanderbilt." She nodded back at them. While she and Sae-dai were waiting for the elevator, she turned to Sae-dai and asked, "Does my makeup look okay?" Sae-dai replied, "Yeah, it looks fine." Maisie let out a sigh of relief. She had nearly come late to work because Nolan insisted on having an intimate activity with her this morning. After both of them stepped into the elevator, Linda, who was hiding in the staircase, pressed the edge of her hat lower. Initially, she did not want to risk herself to do this either. However, that woman had promised she would give her $150,000, and Linda only had 1 day left. Linda bit her lips. "Don't blame me, Maisie." There were not many people in the morning, so she was able to slip into the pantry without any difficulty. She carefully pulled the packet of powder out of her pocket, and after a short moment of hesitation, she poured it into a designated teapot. After doing everything, she took a picture of it and sent it to Cecile. When Linda heard the footsteps from outside, her face turned pale. The door was pushed open. The female staff was stunned when she saw Linda. "Who are you?" she asked. Linda hurriedly willed the nervous expression away and forced a smile on her face. "I'm new here." The female staff was skeptical. "Why haven't I seen you before? Which department are you working in?" Cold beads of sweat were trickling down Linda's back. When she did not know what to say, the receptionist came in. She had seen Linda before and said, "Huh? Aren't you the woman who came to look for Ms. Vanderbilt the other day? What are you doing in our pantry?" "Yeah, I came to look for Ms. Vanderbilt the other day. She let me work here," Linda said. Chapter 1296. "I see." The receptionist nodded and said something to the other female employee. The female employee no longer doubted Linda, so she approached her to take over. "You just started working. All the teas that you see here are reserved especially for the administration department. Ms. Vanderbilt likes to drink Earl Grey, and the temperature mustn't be too hot." Linda nodded, staring at the teapot she had poured the powder into. After the female employee poured water into the teapot, she boiled the pot on the induction cooker. A few minutes passed while they were waiting for the water to boil, and Linda did not dare to speak too much for fear of being discovered. When the water started boiling, the female employee placed a tea bag she took out of a box reserved exclusively for Maisie into the thermos and poured the water into it. Linda took a deep breath as she started to perspire profusely on her temples. But she calmed down as soon as she thought about what the woman had told her, saying that this drink would not kill anyone and that it would only make others sick. The female employee turned to look at Linda. "You can leave this to me and get back to work first." Oh. Okay, thanks." Linda left the scene but bumped into Sae-dai, the woman who followed Maisie around all the time, in the corridor. Linda quickly pulled down the brim of her hat and passed by her in a hurry. Sae-dai stopped and turned to look at the figure that seemed to be escaping from something. The female employee came out with a thermos and said with a grin when she saw Sae-dai, "Are you here for the tea?" "It's just been brewed." Sae-dai took the thermos in her hand and nodded. "Thank you." In the office, Maisie was flipping through some documents when Sae-dai knocked on the door. She pushed open the door, entered, and placed the thermos on the desk. Maisie raised her head and said with a smile, "Thank you for the hard work." She was about to pick up the thermos when Sae-dai reported out of the blue, "I ran into Linda just now." Maisie unscrewed the lid and frowned. Linda? Sadie nodded. She appeared around the pantry region sneakily and ran away immediately when she saw me. Maisie put the thermos back on the desk. Go and check the surveillance footage of that area. Linda came to a small back alley after she escaped from Seoul. Shin then leaned against the wall and panted heavily as she took out her cell phone and called Cecile. However, before the call got through, her cell phone was abruptly snatched away from her grasp. She turned her head around and saw several men standing beside her, and her expression changed instantly. Sadie handed the surveillance footage she had downloaded from the system over to Maisie and then summoned the 2 employees who had been at the pantry into the office. The 2 staff employees did not know what had happened. They did not understand until Sadie asked, "That woman. Did she claim that she's new here, and Ms. Vanderbilt is the person who hired her?" Maisie fiddled with the pen in her hand. Did she say that? Yes, I saw her brewing tea in the pantry when I went in, so I asked, and didn't she come to you yesterday? That's why I thought she was our new colleague. The female employee bowed her head in remorse after explaining her actions. I actually got deceived into making such a mistake. Will I be fired? Okay, I get it. Maisie put the cap of the pen on and stood up. You 2 can go back to your workstations and continue working first. I'll handle this matter. Thank you, Ms. Vanderbilt. The 2 female employees bowed to Maisie and then exited the office. Maisie handed the thermos on the desk to Sadie. Bring this to a lab and test it to see if there's any problem with the tea. At noon, Sadie rushed back to the company from the hospital and just happened to encounter Quincy downstairs. Quincy stopped her while he was getting out of the car. Is Mrs. Goldman in now? Yes, is there anything that requires her attention? Sadie looked at him. Quincy came over with some snacks and shoved them into her arms. Mr. Goldman asked me to bring these here. Can you bring them to Mrs. Goldman while you're on your way up? Chapter 1297. After saying that, Quincy stood with his arms akimbo and complained, "It's not easy to be someone's personal assistant nowadays. Delivering food for my boss is one of the errands I have to run while I'm not managing the company for him. And my salary gets deducted instead of increasing." Sadie glanced at him expressionlessly. I'll pass this message on to Mr. Goldman without leaving out a single word. Don't. Quincy shut up immediately and then looked around with an aggrieved face. I was just joking around, ma'am. I'm begging you. We've been working together for 3 years now. Can we please just live together peacefully? His gaze then landed on the report and thermos that were in Sadie's hand. What are these? Sadie handed the report to him. See it for yourself. Quincy's expression changed slightly when he skimmed through the report. Sadie returned to the office and passed the report results to Maisie. She also reported to her that she had run into Quincy downstairs. Maisie took the report from her and paused for a split second. Did you allow Quincy to go through the content? She nodded and placed the snacks Quincy had handed her on the desk. Maisie looked at the box of snacks and gave off a wry smile. Nolan will definitely be exasperated again this time around. Sadie stared at her. I think it's you who should be livid. Maisie's face dimmed instantly when she saw the sentence. Overdose can lead to shock and even death, which was written on the test report. Linda was taken to an abandoned unfinished building. The man kicked her to the ground as she cried and shuddered. Mr. Donovan, I swear I'll return the $150,000 to you tomorrow. Mr. Donovan took a cigarette handed to him by his subordinate, and his subordinate ignited the lighter and lit the cigarette for him. He then took a sharp puff and exhaled the smoke. Are you sure you can get the money by tomorrow? She nodded. Sure, I'm sure. Mr. Donovan leaned over and puffed a mouthful of smoke at her. But I can't wait any longer. The smoke covered her face, and her body curled into a fetal position as she backed off tremblingly. The blood was drained from her cheeks, and she started to shudder even more vigorously. What do you mean by that? He stretched out 2 fingers. In order to compensate for the losses that I've been incurring these few days, the penalty will at least cost you another $150,000, making the whole payment worth $300,000. Linda's tears gushed down like two streams. But $150,000 is the number that we agreed on. As soon as she said that, Mr. Donovan slapped her. If you can't pay me back, you're coming back with me to serve my customers. Linda got dizzy from all the slapping while she cried and nodded. I'll make it work, I'll definitely make it work. Remember, it's $300,000. I'll give you hell if I don't get the money by tomorrow. Mr. Donovan left with his men after giving her a warning. Linda dragged her beaten self out of the abandoned building, sobbed softly as she picked up her cell phone, and called Cecile. Ms. Wolfsbane, I've done everything according to your instructions, can you please lend me $300,000 first? Mr. Donovan just doubled the amount of money that I owe him all of a sudden. I have no other choice. She could only place all her hope on Cecile. Cecile remained silent for a moment before speaking slowly. Ms. Vanderbilt, Maisie is still alive and kicking, so how can you ask me to lend you the money with confidence? Linda held her breath as she felt chills shooting down her spine and all over her body. Ms. Wolfsbane. What are you talking about? Didn't you say that drug wouldn't kill? Cecile chuckled. An overdose could definitely kill someone, but you can't blame me. You're the one who spiked the drink with one whole packet of the drug. Linda froze in place. I didn't want to kill anyone. I've never thought about killing anyone. It seems you've failed in your mission, you useless piece of shit. Cecile chuckled, but her voice still sounded cold. But it's all right. I won't get into the details with you. I'm waiting for you across the road. Come over. Linda looked at the opposite side of the road, and a car was indeed parked at the roadside. However, what puzzled Linda was how Cecile knew she was there. Chapter 1298. Linda did not overthink it as she urgently needed money now. Thus, she hung up the phone and hurried across the road, but a car appeared out of nowhere and rammed into her. A loud shriek pierced through the stagnant air, and Linda was knocked into the air, flew in the air, and landed a few feet away from the car. One of her shoes fell off, and the screen of the cell phone beside her shattered. Her face landed on the ground, and she seemed to be staring straight ahead with an unwilling gaze. Her fingertips trembled as her pupils gradually dilated, and a pool of scarlet blood oozed out from behind her head. A man walked up to her, picked up her phone with a gloved hand, pulled out the SIM and SD card, broke them forcibly, and threw them into the flower bed in the middle of the road. He then walked back to the parked car and got into the car. Cecile, who was sitting in the rear seat, retracted her gaze as the corners of her cherry lips twitched. Let's go, Maisie called Hector, obtained Linda's number from him, and tried to call her, but her phone was turned off. Hence, she asked Sadie to track Linda down. However, the result of the investigation led them to the hospital's mortuary. She hurried to the hospital with Sadie. The police officers were communicating with the doctor when she stepped forward and asked, "Excuse me, may I know if the deceased who was brought in is called Linda Vanderbilt?" One of the officers picked up the ID card and took a glance at it. "Who are you, and what's your relationship with the deceased?" Maisie pursed her lower lip. "I'm her cousin." The police officer nodded. "We're just trying to contact her family members, but because her phone has broken, and the SIM card isn't in the phone," Maisie frowned. "What's the cause of death?" He replied, "A car accident." Apparently, the street where she was knocked over didn't have any surveillance cameras set up, so the perpetrator fled. When she was found, and we rushed to the scene, it was already too late. The officers left after asking Maisie some more questions. Maisie was left standing in the empty corridor, wondering about something. Nolan and Quincy arrived later. He saw Maisie sitting on the bench and hurried forward. "Z." Maisie lifted her head but could not even force a faint smile. "I didn't expect things to end like this." Nolan frowned. After a long time, he crouched down in front of her and covered the back of her hand with his palm. Quincy has already told me about the incident. Z, the important thing here is that you're fine. Maisie lowered her head and leaned on his shoulder. Even if Linda hated me to the bones, she wouldn't want to kill me and would at most only want to retaliate against me. So, I think she's been taken advantage of. If Linda wanted to kill me, she would have done it long ago. She needed the money desperately, which makes it even more unlikely for her to kill me because she would come to me when she's desperate. Maisie had seen through Linda's mindset long ago, but she did not expect that Linda would run into an accident. Nolan hugged her and stroked her hair. Don't worry. I'll get to the bottom of this matter. Yorick and Madame Vanderbilt were informed that their daughter and granddaughter had encountered an accident and traveled to Basburg overnight. When it came to the moment to claim his daughter's body from the morgue, Yorick turned his head away as he did not dare to look straight at her. Madame Vanderbilt stood frozen in place for a while, but she did not cry hysterically. This is just unfortunate. The daughter that's been with us for more than 20 years died just like that. I told her not to come to Basburg and find herself a family to get married to as soon as possible. Now, look at what happened. Yorick did not utter a single word. He took out a packet of cigarettes, walked silently to the corridor, took one out, and lit it. Maisie and Sadie walked out of the elevator. She asked Sadie to wait for her there and walked toward Yorick alone. Uncle. Yorick took 2 puffs of smoke. His hands were shaking and his voice sounded hoarse. Both the mother and the daughter, both of them had had a rough life. I'm already investigating the accident. As long as the perpetrator is caught, maybe. Before she could finish the sentence, Madame Vanderbilt walked out of the morgue and saw Maisie. Her expression dimmed immediately. Ever since a few years ago, after Layla's incident, the Vanderbilts have always been overcast by a series of misfortunes. All the damned ones are dead now, so let's just all end this right here, right now. Chapter 1299. Mother, please just stop. Linda is already lying in the morgue, so what else do you want? Yorick felt very upset too. Madame Vanderbilt shut up wisely. Maisie did not take Madame Vanderbilt's words to heart and looked at Yorick. I'll pay for the funeral's expenses. We'll get to the bottom of the incident when we find out about the cause of the accident. At Black Gold. Quincy walked next to Nolan. Mr. Goldman, I've located the nightclub for which Linda worked before this. The owner is known locally as Mr. Donovan, and he runs an illegal loan shark organization. His nightclub business isn't clean either, as he provides special services for his guests. I also found out that he often exploits his female employees, deceiving them into taking nude loans from him. When they cannot pay him back, he'll get them to serve guests according to his requirements. Nolan's gaze looked keen. Who does he have supporting him from behind the scenes? Quincy skimmed through the information. Among his clientele is Mr. Saldana from the Fortune Building Incorporated. By the way, Mr. Saldana once had business dealings with the Hannigans 3 years ago, but there doesn't seem to be any obvious interaction between the two companies over the past 3 years. So, maybe you can turn to Mr. Hannigan for more information. He should know something about this. Nolan did not say anything. When the two of them passed by the elevator, a woman stepped out of the elevator abruptly and bumped into him. Quincy was about to teach the woman a lesson, but he was momentarily stunned when the woman lifted her head. Cecile had already seen Nolan pass by from within the elevator, and she had chosen to bump into him on purpose. She could not contain her excitement and pretended to be caught off guard. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, I didn't see you. Nolan glanced at the woman indifferently and gave off a faint frown. She's the woman that appeared on one of the interview documents. But this woman gives me a strange feeling, just like what Quincy told me before, and I don't like this sensation. Nolan unbuttoned his jacket and walked away without saying a word. Quincy took a glimpse at the woman, smiled at her out of courtesy, and immediately caught up to Nolan's footsteps. Nolan took off his jacket because another woman's perfume had stained it. He then threw the jacket into the cleaning cart parked in the corridor by the cleaner. Quincy felt extremely helpless. This jacket costs thousands of dollars, yet he throws it away just because he feels like doing so. If Mrs. Goldman were to learn about his action, she'd definitely reprimand Mr. Goldman for being such a prodigal man. Cecile naturally saw this scene, and the corner of her lips twitched slightly. Now that I got a closer look at him, he looks even more attractive than he was a few years back. She rubbed her fingertips across the corners of her lips, and her eyes looked cold. As expected of a man that you can't even keep by your side. Linda's body was cremated at the funeral home, but Madame Vanderbilt did not attend the funeral. Yorick and his wife were the only ones who were there by Linda's coffin when it was time to send her off. When the cremation process was over, the staff handed an urn to Yorick. Yorick held the urn in his hands, feeling deeply aggrieved and sorrowful. Maisie walked out of the funeral home with them. Yorick turned to look at her before she sent them into the car. Thank you. Maisie nodded. Bring this back and organize a proper burial for her. I'll get back to you when we get our hands on the investigation results. Yorick and his wife got into the car and left. After the car disappeared from her sight, Maisie followed Sadie back to the car. Sadie asked if Maisie wanted to return to the company, and Maisie replied, "We're heading to Black Gold." Maisie and Sadie appeared at the Black Gold group. All the staff members who worked at Black Gold's front desk knew about Maisie and greeted her with a smile. "It's nice to see you, Mrs. Goldman." Maisie walked up to the elevator dedicated to the CEO, and Sadie pressed the button on the wall. When the doors opened, and they were about to step into the elevator, someone stopped her. "Are you Mrs. Goldman?" Maisie stopped, turned around, and looked at the woman who was approaching her. She squinted slightly as if she had seen the woman standing in front of her somewhere else. She looked almost perfect as she approached them. Her stern and gorgeous face subconsciously made Maisie think of someone. Chapter 1300. The wording on her name tag showed that she was Cecile Wolfsbane from the strategy department. Cecile had a jacket in her hands, and Maisie was very familiar with the custom-made jacket that Nolan wore to the office earlier this morning. Maisie raised his eyebrows slightly and chuckled. "Miss, is there anything that I can help you with?" Cecile lowered her gaze and handed her the jacket. "Mr. Goldman has dropped this jacket. Since you're his wife, please return it to him for me." "Thank you." Maisie took a glimpse at the jacket in Cecile's hand, and her gaze shifted onto Cecile's face. She did not grab the jacket directly from Cecile, but asked Sadie to grab it for her instead. Sadie took the jacket into her hands, and Maisie walked into the elevator with her without uttering another word. The moment the elevator's doors slowly closed, isolating the people on both sides of the doors, Cecile smirked out of the blue. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror, and her face was filled with smugness. Maisie walked into Nolan's office. Nolan was indeed not wearing a jacket, and Quincy was talking with him when he saw Maisie first. "Mrs. Goldman?" When his gaze landed on the jacket in Sadie's hands, he was stunned. That jacket wasn't it. Sadie threw the jacket to Quincy, and he caught it with a bewildered look on his face. Nolan leaned against the edge of the desk with a smirk on his face. "Why did you pick this jacket up from the cleaning cart?" "I didn't pick it up." Maisie shrugged, walked to the couch, sat down, and grabbed a teacup from the desk. "It was given to me by a woman named Cecile. She asked me to bring it to you." Nolan's eyes narrowed slightly. Quincy was surprised and explained to Maisie, "The woman named Cecile bumped into Mr. Goldman this morning, so Mr. Goldman threw away his jacket, saying that it smelled of her perfume. He's afraid that you'd misunderstand." "So did the woman pick the jacket up and give it back to Mrs. Goldman?" Maisie blinked and said nothing. Nolan asked Sadie and Quincy to exit the office. After the two left, he walked to the couch, leaned over, propped his hands against the back of the couch, and approached her. "You're worried about me." Maisie leaned back, looked at him, and could not help but sneer. Why would I worry about you? Nolan pinched her chin and gently rubbed her lips with his fingertips. You're worried that I would cheat on you with another woman. She raised her hand to flatten his tie and smiled. Wouldn't I have to live the rest of my life carefully and fearfully if I didn't even have any trust for you? There's no way I'm going to do that. He sneered, turned over, and took her into his arms. That woman thinks she's smart. I'll get Quincy to notify the Human Resource Department to fire her immediately. Maisie was astonished, but she thought of something all of a sudden. Don't fire her first. I have a feeling that this woman came prepared. Nolan narrowed his eyes and said nothing. Maisie was silent for a moment, and her lips slowly moved. A newcomer who's just joined the company, who's never seen me, but knows who I am, and handed me the jacket deliberately without any explanation. If this were to happen to a woman who doesn't trust her husband at all, she would have lost her cool on the spot. Nolan tucked the hair hanging over her forehead behind her ears with a pregnant expression. You think she's strange too, huh? If I hadn't seen Rowena die at the bottom of the sea with my very own eyes, I would have suspected that she's Rowena. But if you go deeper into the details of the incident, if Rowena were to be alive right now, she would have wanted to cover all her trails out of fear of being discovered. Maisie looked at Nolan. But that woman resembles Rowena in a lot of ways. Even her facial features and gaze remind me of Rowena. I'll get Quincy to keep an eye on her. Nolan rubbed the top of her head, and his gaze became sterner and clearer instantly. I would also like to know who the heck she is.